They did not find any debris, no bodies, no wood, no oil, nothing. And so how do you blow a submarine in half and nothing comes up?
I definitely want to get your thoughts on the controversy of artifact recovery. Some people say it's a war grave. You shouldn't be touching this stuff.
We had been told that the crew would write their name on their boots, so we were covering boots.
I am very much of the school of thought that if you got a shipwreck where people have died, I don't think there's anything wrong with photographing it, exploring it, but you don't touch stuff and bring it back.
Now, one of the things that's unusual with U-boats is that although the Third Reich is gone, the war graves of their German sailors from World War I and World War II is now, in effect, the property and under the guardianship of the current German government.
Richie and John had a dilemma, and that was the Germans were saying, well, it's not our U-boat, but if it is, you got to keep your hands off it. And they went, well, hold it. It's either your U-boat or it's not.
History X membership has its privileges. To access unedited versions of this and many other History X videos, consider becoming a History X member. And now part 4 of Hitler's Lost Sub, Mystery of the U-869, with special guest deep sea detective Richie Kohler.
What is this? This doesn't make sense. This Nazi U-boat is not supposed to be here. And it started a fever because it was truly an enigma. We all went to our libraries and started saying, well, how did this submarine, fall through the cracks? How did a Nazi U-boat wind up off of Atlantic City, New Jersey, and no one knows? So we reached out to different experts. We contacted the U.S. Navy. We contacted the German Navy, their naval attaché based in New York City. We had gone to the U.S. Naval Weapons Station, Earl. We went to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. We also went down to Carterock Explosives down in Maryland and showed them video of the wreck. And they were the ones that said that the damage that we're seeing here is commensurate with a torpedo. How the conning tower is on its side. To them, it seemed like it was a torpedo. One of the people at Naval Weapons Earl had mentioned to us that a number of U.S. submarines had circular run torpedoes. One of them, the USS Tang, had sunk because of its own torpedo in the Formosa Strait. We're like, well, if you're telling us this looks like torpedo damage, then that's it. And so that was the working theory for many years. And then somebody came forward and said that the wreck had been depth charged by a U.S. Coast Guard cutter and an American destroyer in late February or March 1945. So we interviewed Captain Judson, who is the captain of the U.S. Navy ship, and he said that, yes, they did depth charge target, but it acted like a wreck. It didn't move, and there was no preponderance of debris, no oil came up. And so the discrepancy is, how do you blow a submarine in half and nothing comes up? John Chatterton and I seem to believe that the submarine may have already been dead, filled with water. Everything that would have floated away. The oil would have floated away because both the USS Coiner and the Crow adopted a series of depth charges, but they did not find any debris, no bodies, no wood, no oil, nothing. So with nothing coming to the surface, they declared it just a shipwreck and sailed away. And so a couple of years after we had positively identified the wreck, the NOVA program had come out, shadow divers had come out, the U.S. Coast Guard claims that it killed the U-869, despite the fact that the U.S. Navy believed that it was a wreck. And so it's subjective. I wasn't there. I don't know. I know that there's definitely depth charge damage in the stern, where you can see that the hull is bent in and pressed down from an outward force. You can kind of see it in that drawing above the after torpedo room. You can see that it's bent in, and it's clearly depth charge damage. But the center part of the submarine is blown outward, which the experts at Carterock said that was indicative of an explosion. Now another person has just come out, a gentleman named Hamilton has written a book and said that there's a possibility it was a hydrogen explosion, because of built up gases that occurred when U-boats were snorkeling, and that there's evidence of this having occurred in the English Channel with German U-boats. So now there's three different theories: whether she killed herself with her own torpedo firing it on target, she was sunk by the Coiner and Crow, American destroyer and a Coast Guard cutter, or she blew herself up with an internal explosion and then was laying dead on the seafloor until the Coiner and Crow ran over it as an anomaly and depth charged it. The thing is that they did not have movement. They just ran over a metal target and they depth charged it, which happens to a lot of shipwrecks during World War II. A lot of the shipwrecks that we dive have been blown to pieces because they weren't taking any chances. So I don't have the answer. That's not where my area of expertise would lay to tell you how she died. I can only tell you how we treated it and how we identified it.
Well, before we logged on tonight and went live, you caught John and I and Connor kind of talking about
my crazy theory.
Well, the theories, because he had the action reports from the Coiner.
So yeah, the war diaries are available, and the Coiner and the Crow were sitting outside New York City about to start a convoy on February 11th, 45, and they got called to go attack a sonar contact, and you can read all in the war diaries. They're dropping depth charges for hours on this target. And when you plot the coordinates of the Crow for 8 p.m. on the 11th, it's 12 or 15 miles away from the wreck. So my theory, and this is just rereading this book and then just coming up with this, is that this sub fired her acoustic torpedo at this convoy that was forming up. It circled back and hit the sub. They sank. And then the two destroyer escorts got the contact, went and depth charged a wreck. Because in the war diary it says hours of depth charge attacks classified as non-sub, which you could say, well, they're hitting a wreck. So that's my theory right now. Who knows?
It's as good as any other, my friend.
Yeah.
Well, I know you said that, these are all just theories and that you're not the expert, but in this story, I can't think of anybody else who would be more qualified to throw their opinion into the ring. So what do you think happened?
One of the things I love to say, which has been my guiding force in diving shipwrecks, is let the wreck tell you what happened. And that's whether or not I'm trying to find an artifact or an answer of the events that occurred. In this particular instance, I've dove a number of German U-boats. And I challenge you guys to look up images of other sunken U-boats, whether it's the U-853, which was depth charged constantly for 2 days. 2 days. And it's 100 feet shallower. It's in 130 foot of water. Its conning tower is up, and there's no massive explosion. They literally blew the 853 up until the captain's hat floated up. They literally recovered the German commander's hat from the water. They recovered bodies. They recovered items, cloth, furniture, and still the submarine remains contiguous. It's intact. There's holes punched into it, but it's not split open like a can that somebody put in an M80 in.
Yeah, we were just talking about this a month ago. And John, you said that the Slater Museum has what from the 853?
Yeah. At the museum, we have the life raft, some of the debris, and the hat that floated to the surface. It's on display.
And they sent a diver down. There was unexploded depth charges and hedgehogs everywhere.
Yep.
And he recovered one body that was blocking the conning tower. He opened the hatch and pulled out a body. And that sailor is buried in Newport, Rhode Island. And it says Ein Bekannter, one unknown German sailor. And that was recovered by a U.S. Navy diver. And the key here is to answer your question is that particular submarine is not blown into pieces. And if you look at the U-701, which was sunk by aerial bomb off the Hatteras, it's remarkably intact. If you look at the U-352, which was sunk by massive depth charging, or the U-85, which was also sunk by depth charging and killed its entire crew, they're all intact. They're all one continuous submarine with small punches of depth charge damage. So I don't have an answer for you. I always like using experts to tell me what they think. and I'm not an explosives expert. That's why I mentioned that we went to Carter Rock. We went to Naval Weapons Earl, Philadelphia Navy Yard. We spoke with explosive experts. They were the ones that said, this is what it looks like. And we've even had some computer modeling done to say, could a depth charge create this damage? And the only way that it could happen is if the depth charge exploded inside the submarine.
Because some of the framework was blasted outward.
That's correct.
Now, I definitely want to get your thoughts on artifact recovery, the controversy of artifact recovery. Some people say you shouldn't be touching this stuff. Other people, like me, for example, I can appreciate if it's a war grave, but if you hadn't brought this stuff to the surface, you never would have identified the submarine. So what is your line of thinking there?
Since we're talking about U-869, I'm going to focus on that. John Chatterton and I recovered various objects from the wreck in an effort to, number one, identify it, but along the way, we had to narrow down the field. And people say to me, well, why were you recovering crockery? If you look at the crockery, you'll actually notice that the Germans put the year on the crockery. It says 1942. And we actually found crockery with the year 1944. So we knew that the wreck could not have sank before 1944. So the recovery of crockery was one of many clues that helped us narrow down the field.
Richie, the Atlantic wreck diver, who dove on the Andrea Doria and all that stuff, he was a pirate. And he would take plates and portholes and everything else. That is not Richie today. And it wasn't even Richie when he was diving on the U-869.
We had been told by Horst Bredauer and other people that some members of the crew would write their name on their boots. So we started covering boots. But then we felt that that was way too personal, so we stopped. We only recovered actually one boot. There was no name on it. And then we realized that there's quite a possibility that someone was wearing those boots, so we stopped that. So every artifact that we recover was in an effort to keep narrowing it down.
Richie and John had a dilemma, and that was they went to the United States Navy and they said, hey, we found a U-boat 65 miles off New Jersey, and the Navy said, we didn't sink it. And went to the Germans, and the Germans said, we didn't lose it. So they have this U-boat. They know it's a U-boat, but nobody's claiming it. So they pulled artifacts specifically to be able to identify it.
John recovered an escape lung, which basically looks like a life preserver, but an escape lung is a device for submariners. They can breathe off of it. It looks like a life preserver, and they can escape from a sunken submarine and come to the surface. That escape lung that John recovered is unique in that John brought the air cylinder, the oxygen cylinder that was attached to it, back to his house and put it in his garage. And overnight, as it dried, it blew up. He didn't realize that it still had pressure in it and that it had been so fatigued from 70 years underwater that it split in two and exploded and blew up his garage. And when I mean blew up, I mean it blew things off the shelf and, knocked things down. But at the same time, it knocked off the incrustation. And on the shoulder of it, you could clearly see a manufacturer hydrostatic date. And that date was November of 1944. So that we knew that this had to be a late war U-boat.
The Germans were never in love with the idea of it, but they couldn't refuse because they couldn't claim that they knew what it was. That's why Richie pulled artifacts.
This was one of the last U-boats most likely to sortie. It could have been one of the U-boats that was against Operation Teardrop, that had been sent to operate against the United States, or particularly New York. So these were incredible clues.
The Germans were saying, well, it's not our U-boat, but if it is, you got to keep your hands off it. And they went, well, hold it. It's either your U-boat or it's not. So if it's not your U-boat, then you don't care. You can't identify it. We want to identify it for the sake of the men who served on board.
The recovery of objects, like the Hornberg knife, was no longer important to us from the collection of them. It became important to the story. And once we recovered the tag with the identifying mark of the U-869, we never recovered anything again.
They knew when they entered the U-869, they could see the bones. They knew that this was a ship on which people had died. There was a whole, in the control room, it's littered with bones.
Not only that, every family member that I met would invariably ask for me to bring things to the wreck. They didn't ask me to go get anything, but I would offer them. So whether it was crockery, I did give some of the family members artifacts from the wreck as a memento or a memory of their brother or their loved one. We gave artifacts to the U-boat archive, as you saw, because that was the proper place to put them. And that was it. That ended taking objects from the U-boat. So the purpose of recovering objects was so that we could identify the submarine and identify the men. And that was it.
They didn't pull artifacts because they were treasure hunting. Richie is today very much against that kind of thing. In general, I am very much of the school of thought that if you got a shipwreck where people have died, I don't think there's anything wrong with photographing it, exploring it, but you don't touch stuff and bring it back.
Now, when you talk about the big picture of artifact recovery, there's laws in effect. If a shipwreck is a war grave, if it's a naval vessel that sank, regardless of the reason, it's considered a war grave, and the only people that can recover anything from it is their government. And so you can visit American warships, but you can't take anything except pictures. If you're in English waters and you're diving British submarines or British shipwrecks, the same rules apply, no matter where you are in the world. Now, one of the things that's unusual with U-boats is that although thankfully the Third Reich is defunct and gone, the war graves of their German sailors from World War I and World War II is now in effect the property and under the guardianship of the current German government. And the same way that the CS Hunley, the Confederate submarine Hunley, is now under the protection of the United States government, their sworn enemy. But that's who's protecting the wreck. They recovered the wreck. They removed and interred the remains of the Confederate sailors on board. So military wrecks have a very special status, and only the surviving government or the government that is responsible for them can do any recovery. Merchant vessels are a whole other kettle of fish. There's now policies called UNESCO, which is governing the control of shipwrecks throughout the world. Most of the members of the United Nations signed on to UNESCO, which basically says any shipwreck that's over 100 years old is historic no matter where it is, no matter what it is, and therefore it shouldn't be violated. Shipwrecks that are in state waters are protected by the state. Shipwrecks that are in international waters, you can recover things from them if they are truly abandoned in international waters. And then, as you guys know, the shipwrecks of the Great Lakes are protected because they are not international waters, they're state waters. And so they fall under state protection. And there are places in the world like Truk Lagoon in Micronesia, where the Micronesian government has protected all of the Japanese shipwrecks in the lagoon, and it is a diving mecca. People go there. There's war wrecks in other areas that are protected by government agencies, whether there's civilian wrecks or not. So it depends where you are in the world, whether or not it is lawful to recover objects from shipwrecks. When I was a kid, it was the Wild West. If there were laws, nobody knew about them. And then over the last 40 years, not only have the laws been enacted and enforced, but they've been clarified and they've been expanded upon. And so today's shipwreck divers, most of them don't recover artifacts. Most of them visit the shipwreck to swim through history, to get dinner if they are so inclined, and to take pictures.
One of the viewers, Divers Down, asked the question, have you been back? And of course, the answer's yes, because you gave me a video that you shot from 2020. Continue on to part 5 of this history exploration of Hitler's lost sub, as deep sea detective Richie Kohler takes us through the wreck of the U-869.